I was only 8 when my Uncle Daniel vanished without a trace. He wasn't like the other adults in our family who treated kids like we were invisible or annoying. Daniel actually cared about what I had to say. He'd sit on the floor with me, building Lego castles, and listening to my rambling stories about school like they were the most important things in the world. My mom always said he was too soft, that he spoiled me rotten. She'd roll her eyes when he'd slip me an extra cookie after dinner or let me stay up past my bedtime to watch cartoons with him. But I loved those moments. Daniel made me feel like I mattered, like my thoughts and feelings were worth something. He lived in the small apartment above our garage in our house in Millbrook. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he got back on his feet after his divorce. But months turned into a year, and honestly, I hoped he'd never leave. Having him around made everything better. He'd walk me to school some mornings, telling me jokes that made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. He knew all the best spots in town too. The ice cream shop that gave extra sprinkles, the park with the tallest slide, the library corner where they kept the best comic books. Daniel worked odd jobs around town. He fixed Mrs. Patterson's fence, helped the Johnsons move their furniture, painted Mr. Wilson's shed. He wasn't rich, but he always seemed happy. At least that's what I thought at the time. Looking back now, I remember things differently. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with this distant look in his eyes, like he was somewhere else entirely. He'd get phone calls that made him tense up, his voice dropping to a whisper as he'd step outside to talk. Once I found him sitting on his bed with his head in his hands, but when he saw me, he forced a smile and asked if I wanted to play cards. The last time I saw him, he was sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. My mom was at work, and it was just the two of us. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his car keys and checking his phone every few minutes. I asked him what was wrong, but he just ruffled my hair and said everything was fine. He promised we'd go fishing that weekend at Miller's Pond, just like we always did, but that weekend never came. When I woke up Saturday morning, excited about our fishing trip, my mom sat me down at the same kitchen table where I'd last seen him. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she tried to explain that Daniel had left during the night. She said he'd taken his clothes and his car, but that was about it. No note, no goodbye, nothing. I ran to the garage apartment, hoping she was wrong. The door was unlocked, and most of his things were still there. His favorite coffee mug sat in the sink. His books were still on the shelf, and the drawing he'd made of me was still taped to his mirror. It didn't make sense. Why would he leave without saying goodbye? Why would he leave his things behind? For weeks, I kept expecting him to come back. Every car that drove down our street made my heart race. I'd press my face against the window, hoping to see his old blue Honda pulling into the driveway. But he never came. The adults in my family stopped talking about him after a while, like he'd never existed at all. They packed up his remaining things and stored them in the attic. And life went on as if Daniel had never been part of it. But I couldn't forget. I carried the weight of his absence everywhere I went. At school, when other kids talked about their uncles, I'd feel that familiar ache in my chest. At family gatherings, I'd look around expecting to see him in the corner, making faces at me from across the room. The fishing rod he'd bought me for my birthday sat unused in the garage, a constant reminder of promises that would never be kept. Something deep inside me knew the adults weren't telling me the whole truth. There was more to Daniel's disappearance than they were letting on, and I was determined to find out what really happened to the only adult who had ever truly understood me. 14 years later, I was helping my mom clean out the attic before she sold the house. I'd moved back to Millbrook after college, and the old place felt smaller than I remembered. Every corner held memories of Daniel, and I found myself looking for traces of him in the dusty corners and forgotten boxes. I was searching for my old suitcase when I noticed something odd tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. It was a wooden box I'd never seen before, made of dark mahogany with intricate carvings along the edges. Unlike everything else in the attic, it wasn't covered in dust or cobwebs. Someone had been taking care of it. My hands trembled as I lifted it down. It was heavier than I expected, and there was something about it that felt important, sacred almost. The latch opened with a soft click, and my breath caught when I saw what was inside. On top was a folded piece of paper with my name written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Just seeing those letters made my chest tighten. Underneath were some of his old drawings, the silly cartoons he used to make for me, a sketch of our house, and one of me as a kid sitting by Miller's Pond. There was also a photograph I'd never seen before, Daniel standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. They both looked serious, almost afraid, but it was the letter that made my world shift. As I unfolded it, I could smell his cologne still lingering on the paper after all these years. "If you're reading this, I've been gone a long time," it began. My eyes filled with tears as I read his words, written in the same careful script he'd used to help me with my homework. The letter was different from the Daniel I remembered. Gone was the light-hearted uncle who told jokes and made me laugh. This Daniel was frightened, desperate. He wrote about watching over his shoulder, about not being able to trust anyone in the family. He mentioned things I didn't understand, conversations he'd overheard, documents he'd found, secrets that could destroy everything. "I never wanted to leave you," he wrote. "You were the only good thing in my life, the only reason I stayed as long as I did. But I discovered something that put both of us in danger. I couldn't risk anything happening to you because of me." He went on to describe how he'd tried to do the right thing, how he'd confronted someone in the family about what he'd learned. But instead of support, he'd been met with threats. Someone had made it clear that if he didn't disappear quietly, there would be consequences. Not just for him, but for me too. The letter was vague about the details, but the fear in his words was unmistakable. He'd been torn between protecting me and seeking justice, and in the end, he'd chosen to protect me. He'd left everything behind. His life, his happiness, his relationship with me, because he believed it was the only way to keep me safe. Near the end of the letter, he mentioned a place from our childhood, Willow Creek, where we used to go for walks when I was little. He'd hidden something there, something that would help me understand the truth if I ever decided to look for it. "But only go if you're ready," he warned. "Once you know, you can't unknow it." I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading and rereading his words. The storm outside matched the chaos in my mind. Everything I'd believed about Daniel's disappearance was wrong. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd sacrificed himself to protect me. The family I'd trusted, the people who'd raised me, had been lying to me for 14 years. I thought about all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong, why he'd left without saying goodbye. I thought about the anger I'd carried, the feeling of being abandoned by the one person who'd truly cared about me. All of it had been based on a lie. But now I had a choice to make. I could put the letter back in the box, pretend I'd never found it, and go on with my life. Or I could follow the trail Daniel had left for me, even though it might lead to truths I wasn't prepared to face. The photograph of Daniel and the unknown woman stared up at me from the box. Who was she? What role had she played in his disappearance? And most importantly, what secret had been worth destroying both our lives to protect? I knew what I had to do. I owed it to Daniel, and I owed it to myself. The next morning, I would drive to Willow Creek and find whatever he'd left for me there. After 14 years of questions, I was finally going to get some answers. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept the letter next to my bed, reading it over and over, trying to piece together the fragments of truth Daniel had left behind. Every word felt like a breadcrumb, leading deeper into a forest I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. The woman in the photograph haunted me. She had kind eyes but looked exhausted, like she'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Daniel had his arm around her protectively, but there was tension in both their faces. On the back of the photo, he'd written, "Sarah." She tried to help, in his careful handwriting. Who was Sarah? And help with what? Reading between the lines of Daniel's letter, I started to understand that he'd stumbled onto something big. He mentioned finding documents that didn't add up, and money that came from nowhere. He wrote about confronting someone he trusted, someone who'd been like a father to him. The betrayal in his words was crushing. "I thought I knew this family," he'd written. "I thought we were good people, but I was wrong about so many things. The business, the money, the way certain people in town treated us with a respect that felt more like fear. It all makes sense now. Our family ran a small construction company in Millbrook. My grandfather had started it in the 1960s, and my father had taken it over when I was young. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. People in town knew us, respected us. I'd always been proud of our family name, proud of the work we did in the community. But Daniel's letter painted a different picture. He'd discovered that some of the company's contracts weren't legitimate. Money was being moved through fake accounts, and some of the buildings we'd supposedly constructed didn't exist. It was a complex web of fraud that had been going on for years, possibly decades. The most devastating part was learning who was behind it all. Daniel didn't name names directly, but he didn't need to. The references to the man who raised me like a son and the person I trusted most in the world made it clear he was talking about my grandfather. My grandfather had died just a few months before Daniel disappeared. At the time, I'd thought it was grief that had made Daniel so withdrawn and distant. Now I realized it was something much worse. He'd discovered that the man he'd looked up to his entire life was a criminal, but the fraud wasn't the worst part. According to Daniel's letter, when he'd tried to expose the truth, he'd been threatened. Someone had made it clear that if he went to the police, there would be consequences. Not just legal consequences, but physical ones. They'd threatened to hurt me, to hurt my mom, to destroy what was left of our family. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of my conscience, he'd written. You were just a child. You deserved to grow up safe and happy, even if it meant I had to disappear from your life. The letter revealed that Daniel had been given a choice: leave quietly and never come back, or face the consequences. He'd chosen to protect us, even though it meant sacrificing his own happiness and future. He'd also mentioned trying to gather evidence, working with someone who could help him build a case. That's where Sarah came in. She was a journalist who'd been investigating corruption in small-town construction companies. Daniel had reached out to her, thinking she could help him expose the truth safely. But they'd been discovered. Someone in the family had found out about their meetings, about the evidence they'd been collecting. The threats had escalated quickly after that. Daniel was told he had 24 hours to leave town, or people would start getting hurt. I wanted to take you with me, he'd written. I wanted to grab you and run somewhere safe where we could start over. But I realized that running would only make things worse. They'd never stop looking for us, and you'd never have a normal life. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I let you go. The letter ended with coordinates, a precise location in Willow Creek where he'd hidden more evidence. He'd written it as insurance, in case something happened to him, in case the truth needed to come out someday. If you're reading this, then you're old enough to decide what to do with this information, he'd concluded. I won't tell you what choice to make, but whatever you decide, know that I never stopped loving you. Everything I did to protect you. I just hope someday you can forgive me for leaving. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. The family I'd trusted, the people who'd comforted me after Daniel's disappearance, had been the ones responsible for driving him away. They'd let me suffer for 14 years, let me believe I'd been abandoned, when the truth was that Daniel had sacrificed everything to keep me safe. But now I knew the truth, and I had to decide what to do with it. Daniel had left me a choice, just like he'd been given a choice all those years ago. I could let sleeping dogs lie, or I could finish what he'd started. The coordinates burned in my mind as I finally drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow I would go to Willow Creek and find whatever Daniel had left for me there. I owed him that much, and I owed myself the complete truth, no matter how painful it might be. The drive to Willow Creek felt like traveling back in time. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but my body seemed to remember the winding roads and hidden turns. Daniel used to drive this same route every few weeks, his old Honda loaded with sandwiches and comic books for our afternoon adventures. The parking area was smaller than I remembered, overgrown with weeds and barely visible from the main road. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering courage. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive home, to pretend I'd never found that box in the attic. But Daniel's words echoed in my mind. You're old enough to decide what to do with this information. The trail into the woods was nearly invisible now, choked with brambles and fallen branches. I had to push through thick undergrowth, my jeans catching on thorns and my sneakers slipping on moss-covered rocks. The forest had reclaimed most of the path we used to walk so easily. As I went deeper into the woods, memories flooded back. This was where Daniel had taught me to identify different bird calls, where he'd shown me how to skip stones across the creek, where he'd listened patiently as I chattered about everything and nothing. Those had been the happiest times of my childhood, just the two of us surrounded by trees and possibility. The clearing where we used to have our picnics was barely recognizable. What had once been a sunny spot perfect for spreading blankets was now shadowed by towering oaks and maples. The creek still bubbled nearby, but it seemed smaller, more subdued. I stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of memory and loss. Using my phone's GPS, I found the exact coordinates Daniel had written in his letter. They led to a massive oak tree on the far side of the clearing, its trunk scarred and weathered by years of storms. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but as I circled the tree, I noticed something that didn't belong. A small metal box wedged into a hollow between two large roots. The box was wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, sealed tight against the weather. My heart pounded as I carefully extracted it from its hiding place. It was heavier than I expected, and I could hear something shifting inside when I moved it. I sat down with my back against the oak tree, the same spot where Daniel and I used to eat our sandwiches and watch clouds drift overhead. With shaking hands, I peeled away the plastic wrapping and opened the box. Inside was a cassette tape, its label written in Daniel's careful handwriting, "For when you're ready to hear the whole truth." There was also a manila envelope thick with documents, and a small digital camera wrapped in a protective case. The documents were photocopies of financial records, bank statements, and contracts. Even with my limited understanding of business, I could see the discrepancies Daniel had mentioned. Money flowing through accounts that shouldn't exist, payments to companies that had no real addresses, contracts for work that was never completed. But it was the photographs on the digital camera that made my blood run cold. Daniel had documented everything methodically. Meetings between my grandfather and men I didn't recognize, briefcases full of cash, construction sites that were supposed to be busy with work, but stood empty. The timestamps showed he'd been gathering evidence for months before his disappearance. One photo showed my grandfather shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside the First National Bank. Another captured the same man loading boxes into a truck behind our family's construction office. The dates on the photos corresponded with large deposits into accounts that didn't match our company's official records. I found the cassette player in my car and returned to the clearing to listen to the tape. Daniel's voice, older and more strained than I remembered, filled the quiet forest air. He'd recorded it just days before he disappeared, and I could hear the exhaustion and fear in every word. "I don't know if anyone will ever hear this," he began, "but I need to get it all down, just in case. I've been gathering evidence for 8 months now, ever since I accidentally saw those bank statements in Dad's office. At first, I thought there had to be an explanation, some legitimate reason for the discrepancies. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got." He went on to detail a corruption scheme that had been running for over 20 years. My grandfather had been taking bribes from developers, approving substandard construction, and skimming money from government contracts. The family business I'd been so proud of was built on lies and fraud. The worst part, Daniel's voice continued, is that people got hurt. Buildings that should have been safe weren't. Inspections that should have caught problems were ignored. I found records of at least 3 accidents that could have been prevented if the work had been done properly. The tape revealed that Daniel had tried to confront my grandfather directly, hoping to convince him to come clean and make things right. But instead of remorse, he'd been met with threats. My grandfather had made it clear that the family's reputation and livelihood depended on keeping the truth buried. He told me that if I brought this to the police, he'd make sure everyone knew I was involved too, Daniel said. He had forged documents with my signature, fake records showing I'd been part of the scheme from the beginning. He said he'd destroy Mom, destroy you, destroy everyone I cared about before he'd let me ruin what he'd built. The final part of the recording was the hardest to listen to. Daniel talked about his decision to leave, about how he'd rather sacrifice his own happiness than risk my safety. He'd been planning to disappear quietly, but then he'd met Sarah, the journalist who'd been investigating similar corruption in other towns. "Sarah convinced me that running away wouldn't solve anything," he said. "She helped me understand that the only way to protect you in the long run was to expose the truth, but we needed more time, more evidence. And time was something I didn't have." The recording ended with Daniel's voice breaking as he talked about me. "I know she'll hate me for leaving. I know she'll think I abandoned her. But someday, when she's old enough to understand, I hope she'll forgive me. I hope she'll know that everything I did was out of love. I sat in that clearing until the sun started to set. surrounded by the evidence of my family's crimes and my uncle's sacrifice. The truth was worse than I'd imagined, but it was also a relief. After 14 years of questions and guilt, I finally understood why Daniel had left and what he'd been trying to protect me from. Now I had to decide what to do with this knowledge. I could follow Daniel's example and walk away, let the past stay buried, or I could finish what he'd started, no matter what it cost me. I drove home from Willow Creek with my mind racing and my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The evidence sat in a box on my passenger seat like a ticking bomb, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything in my life was about to explode. My mom was in the kitchen when I got home, making dinner like it was any other day. She looked up when I walked in, flour dusting her apron, and smiled that same warm smile I'd known all my life. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. How could I destroy this peaceful scene with the truth I'd uncovered? "How was your day, honey?" she asked, stirring something on the stove. "Find anything interesting in the attic?" The casual question hit me like a punch to the gut. Did she know about the box? Had she been waiting all these years for me to find it? "Mom," I said, my voice barely steady, "we need to talk about Daniel." Her spoon froze mid-stir. The color drained from her face, and for a moment she looked like she might faint. She set the spoon down carefully and turned to face me, her hands trembling. "What about Daniel?" she asked, but I could hear the fear in her voice. I pulled out the photograph from the box, the one of Daniel and Sarah. "Who is this woman? And don't tell me you don't know, because I can see it in your face." My mom stared at the photo for a long moment, then sank into a chair at the kitchen table. She looked older suddenly, worn down by the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell," she said finally. "She was a journalist from Albany. She came to town asking questions about the construction company, about Grandpa's business dealings." "Was? What happened to her?" My mom's hand shook as she reached for a glass of water. "She died in a car accident about 2 weeks after Daniel disappeared. Single-car collision on Route 9, late at night. The police said she fell asleep at the wheel." The implication hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the fear in Daniel's voice on the tape, the way he'd talked about threats and danger. Had Sarah's death really been an accident? "You knew," I said, my voice rising. "You knew why Daniel left, and you let me believe he'd abandoned me." My mom's eyes filled with tears. "I was trying to protect you. You were just a child, and the truth was too dangerous, too complicated. Protect me from what? From knowing that our family was built on lies? From understanding that the man I looked up to was a criminal?" She flinched at my words, but I couldn't stop. 14 years of pain and confusion poured out of me. "I found everything, Mom. The documents, the photos, the recording. I know about the bribes, the fraud, the cover-ups. I know Grandpa threatened Daniel, threatened me, to keep him quiet." My mom broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I didn't know how deep it went until after Daniel left. I thought it was just some minor business irregularities, nothing serious. But then Grandpa sat me down and told me what would happen if the truth came out. "What did he tell you?" "That the company would be destroyed, that we'd lose everything, that I'd go to prison as an accessory because I'd signed some of the papers without reading them carefully, that you'd be taken away from me because I wouldn't be able to provide for you anymore." The manipulation was breathtaking. My grandfather had used my mom's love for me against her, just like he'd used Daniel's love for our family against him. "But that's not all," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me about the people he worked with, the developers and contractors who were part of the scheme. He said they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who threatened their business, including you." I thought about Sarah's car accident, about the timing of her death. Had my grandfather been right about the danger? Had Daniel's sacrifice actually saved my life? "Where are the papers you signed?" I asked. My mom got up and went to her bedroom, returning with a manila folder. Inside were dozens of documents with her signature, most of them financial forms and contracts she clearly hadn't understood when she'd signed them. "I was grieving when your father died," she said. "Grandpa handled everything. Told me he just needed my signature to keep the business running. I trusted him completely. I never imagined he was setting me up as a fall guy. Looking through the documents, I could see the trap my grandfather had laid. If the fraud had ever been exposed, my mom would have appeared to be a key conspirator. Her signatures were on bank forms, construction contracts, and financial statements that would have made her look guilty of everything. After Daniel left, I started asking questions, my mom continued. I went through your father's old files, tried to understand what had really been going on. That's when I realized how extensive the corruption was, how many people were involved. Why didn't you go to the police then? Because I was scared. Because I had a child to protect. Because I didn't know who else might be involved or how far the corruption reached. And because... She paused, struggling with the words. Because I was a coward. The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to be angry with her, to rage about the 14 years of lies and deception. But looking at her broken down at the kitchen table, I realized she'd been as much a victim as I had. There's something else, she said quietly. About a year after Daniel left, I tried to find him. I hired a private investigator, spent most of my savings looking for any trace of him. What did you find? Nothing. It was like he'd vanished completely. The investigator said it was either because Daniel was very good at hiding, or because... She couldn't finish the sentence. Or because he was dead. She nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I've been living with that possibility for 13 years. Not knowing if my brother is alive or dead. Not knowing if I failed him by not being brave enough to stand up to Grandpa. I sat down across from her, the box of evidence between us on the table. All these years I'd thought my mom was complicit in the lies about Daniel's disappearance. But now I realized she'd been trapped too, caught between protecting me and seeking justice for her brother. We have to do something, I said finally. We can't let this stay buried forever. Daniel gathered all this evidence for a reason. My mom looked at the box with fear in her eyes. What if they come after us? What if the people Grandpa warned me about are still out there? Then we'll face them together. But I can't live with this secret anymore. Daniel sacrificed everything to protect me, and I won't let that sacrifice be meaningless. For the first time in 14 years, I felt like I had a real relationship with my mother. We were finally being honest with each other, finally facing the truth together. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. What do you want to do? She asked. I thought about Daniel's voice on the tape, about Sarah's mysterious death, about all the people who might have been hurt by buildings that weren't built to code. The truth was bigger than our family, bigger than our fears. I want to finish what Daniel started. I want to make sure the people responsible are held accountable. And I want to find out what really happened to him. My mom nodded slowly, wiping away her tears. Then let's do it. Let's finally do right by Daniel. The decision to go to the police wasn't made lightly. My mom and I spent 3 days going through every piece of evidence, organizing it, trying to understand the full scope of what Daniel had uncovered. The deeper we dug, the more horrifying it became. We found records of at least 6 buildings that had been constructed with substandard materials, all of them public structures where people's lives depended on structural integrity. A school cafeteria, a senior center, a low-income housing complex. The thought of children and elderly people in danger because of my grandfather's greed made me sick. On Thursday morning, we walked into the Millbrook Police Department together. Detective Lisa Chen listened to our story with growing disbelief, especially when I played Daniel's recording. She was young, maybe only a few years older than me, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed what we were telling her. This is a lot to take in, she said when we finished. You're alleging corruption going back decades, involving multiple businesses and possibly other officials. This isn't just a local matter anymore. She was right. The evidence pointed to connections beyond our small town, to state contracts and federal funding that had been misappropriated. Within a week, FBI agents were sitting in that same conference room, asking us to go through everything again. Agent Martinez, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, seemed particularly interested in Sarah Mitchell's death. We've reopened that investigation, he told us. There were some irregularities in the original accident report that were never properly investigated. The weeks that followed felt like living in a nightmare. Our story made the local news, then the state news, then national outlets picked it up. Reporters camped outside our house, wanting to interview the family that had blown the whistle on decades of corruption. My mom and I barely left the house, afraid of the attention and the potential danger. But the investigation moved forward. Other victims came forward. Families whose loved ones had been injured in buildings that should have been safe, contractors who'd been pressured to cut corners, city officials who'd been offered bribes to look the other way. The most shocking revelation came 3 months into the investigation. Agent Martinez called us into his office with news that changed everything. "We found him," he said simply. "We found Daniel." My heart stopped. After all these years of wondering, of hoping and fearing, we finally had an answer. "He's alive," Agent Martinez continued quickly, seeing the panic in our faces. "He's been living in Oregon under an assumed name, working as a carpenter. We've been in contact with him, and he's willing to come back to testify." The relief was overwhelming. I broke down crying right there in the FBI office, 14 years of grief and guilt pouring out of me. My mom held me while I sobbed, both of us finally able to mourn properly, and then let go of the pain we'd been carrying. Daniel came home on a Tuesday in October. I barely recognized him at first. He was grayer, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he smiled, it was the same warm smile that had made my childhood so special. "Look how tall you got," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. "I'm so proud of you. So proud of both of you." The reunion was emotional and complicated. There was joy, but also anger and hurt that needed to be worked through. Daniel had made choices that protected us, but also caused us pain. We all had to learn how to be a family again. His testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. The corruption scheme had involved not just my grandfather, but several other local officials, contractors, and developers. The trial lasted 6 months, and by the end, 12 people had been convicted of various charges related to fraud, bribery, and reckless endangerment. My grandfather had died before he could be held accountable, but his co-conspirators weren't so lucky. The man in the expensive suit from Daniel's photographs turned out to be a state inspector who'd been taking bribes for over 15 years. He got 8 years in federal prison. Sarah Mitchell's death was officially ruled a homicide. The evidence showed her car had been tampered with, her brake lines cut. The man responsible was already serving time for other crimes related to the corruption case, but he got an additional life sentence for her murder. The most difficult part was dealing with the aftermath in our community. Some people saw us as heroes for exposing the truth, but others blamed us for destroying the reputation of local businesses and officials. We lost friends, faced harassment, and had to rebuild our lives from scratch. The construction company was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to victims. My mom had to find a new job, starting over in her 50s. I finished my degree and became a social worker, drawn to helping families who'd been through trauma similar to ours. But we were together again, and that made everything else bearable. Daniel bought a small house on the other side of town, close enough to visit but far enough to have his own space. We started new traditions: Sunday dinners, weekend fishing trips, holiday celebrations that felt genuine for the first time in years. 5 years later, I still visit Willow Creek every year on the anniversary of finding Daniel's letter. I bring flowers and sit by the old oak tree, remembering the scared young woman who'd discovered a box of secrets and decided to pursue the truth no matter the cost. The creek still bubbles peacefully, and sometimes I can hear Daniel's voice in the wind, no longer sad or frightened but proud. We did the right thing, even when it was hard. We honored his sacrifice by finishing what he started. Justice isn't always clean or satisfying, but it's necessary. People's lives were saved when those dangerous buildings were inspected and repaired. Other families were spared the pain of corruption because we spoke up. And most importantly, we learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. Daniel was right about one thing. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. But sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. Sometimes the only way to heal is to face the darkness and walk through it toward the light.